Hello, Econ 151 students. This week, Lesson 13 covers Chapter 21. Chapter 21 deals with the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand. So we're going to be answering a few questions in this chapter, and we're going to refer back to earlier chapters that we covered. And specifically, we're going to look at the long-run effects of fiscal policy, how that's going to affect interest rates, investment, and economic growth. We're going to look at the long-run effects of monetary policy on price level and inflation rate. And just a reminder that fiscal policy is the actions of government and Congress, well, President and Congress as government decision makers. And so that's going to be taxing and spending specifically. Monetary policy is the actions of the Federal Reserve Bank to affect the money supply. And this chapter that we're going to be looking at, Chapter 21, focuses on the short-run effects of both fiscal and monetary policies and how they work their way through the economy to change aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the combination of the four components of GDP, so that consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports if it's an open economy. And we've drawn the aggregate demand curve before, and we saw that it sloped downward. And we say that there are three reasons that that aggregate demand curve slopes downward. The first one is the wealth effect, and that tells us as the price level increases, the quantity of output will decrease. The wealth effect has a big effect on that because as wealth changes, as we feel wealthier or we feel less wealthy, it's going to affect our willingness to consume. And this aggregate demand curve is that combination of consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So if wealth increases, our consumption increases, which would increase aggregate demand. And it would also show us this relationship, why there's an inverse relationship. As the price level increases, we're willing to buy less and consumption. And as the price level decreases, we're willing to buy more. Actually, you know what? I'm going to start over. A second explanation for this downward sloping aggregate demand curve is the interest rate effect. And again, there's an inverse relationship. As the price level increases, interest rates increase. If interest rates increase, then demand for goods and services will decrease because part of this is the investment portion of aggregate demand. But there's an inverse relationship. As the price of money increases, the demand for the goods and services that are associated with it are going to decrease, right? So the quantity demanded will decrease. And finally, the third explanation for the downward sloping relationship between price level and output is the exchange rate effect. We looked at this before, where the value of the dollar in foreign markets, so the relationship of the value of the dollar relative to foreign currencies, will have, again, that inverse relationship. As the value of the dollar goes down, our net exports are going to increase because then our dollars are cheaper to people that want to buy our goods. And the reverse is true. As the value of the dollar goes up, there's going to be less purchase of our goods as exports because our dollars cost more to convert to. So those are our reasons. Now, the most important reason of these effects for the U.S. economy is the interest rate effect, because this one definitely has the greatest impact. Next, we're going to look at a supply and demand model that helps explain why the interest rate effect is important and how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. So we're going to look at the theory of liquidity preference. And it's a simple theory of the interest rate. We use this small r to tell us about the interest rate. And the interest rate adjusts to balance supply and demand for the money in the market for money. Money supply, we assume it's fixed by the central bank. And remember, that's a simplifying assumption. We understand there are other factors that will go into the money supply, but for our purposes in creating these models, we assume that the central bank determines that. Money demand reflects how much wealth people want to hold in liquid form. And remember that that's related to the price level. How much money people want to hold available for transactions is money demand. For simplicity, we're going to imagine that household wealth consists of only two assets. Money, which is liquid, and it pays no interest though because you're carrying it in cash is the assumption, and bonds, which pay interest, but they're not as liquid because in order to turn a bond into cash, there has to be a transaction in between. So money demand then is how much money or bonds people want to hold in the event of a transaction. So a household's money demand reflects its preference for liquidity, meaning that they have to make a decision between whether they're going to hold it in the form of money or bonds. The variables that influence this money demand, how much they're going to hold in liquid assets, are output, the level of output, the interest rate, and the price level. So let's imagine that real income rises. Oh, the Y was real income. Sorry about that. Not output. Other things equal, what happens to the money demand? Well, if real income rises, households are going to have more money in their pocket to buy goods and services, so they're going to have a greater money demand because that's that transaction demand. They want to have money to complete these transactions. To get this money, they're going to sell some of their bonds, and this is that trade-off between the bonds and the cash assets. And we're talking about the liquidity preference. So would they rather have the money in the form of bonds or the money in the form of cash, liquid cash? So to get the money that they want for these greater number of transactions, as their income is rising, they're going to attempt to sell some of their bonds. And so here's the connection. An increase in income causes an increase in money demand, other things equal. Right? So that is because as their income is increasing, they want to buy more goods and services, so they're going to convert assets to cash. So let's do a little example here. For A, we say suppose that the interest rate rises, but income and the price level are unchanged. What's going to happen to money demand? Well, we just saw this. And we assume that the interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding money. So what we can say is that when we sell bonds to convert that money into cash, we're giving up the interest that we would have earned on the bond. So the interest rate is what you're giving up in terms of what it would have earned had you left it as a bond. So an increase in that interest rate reduces the money demand, and households want to buy bonds to take advantage of the higher interest rate, right? Because if the interest rate goes down and the money demand decreases, then people are going to look for somewhere else to put their money to take advantage of higher interest rates. So the connection here is an increase in the interest rate causes a decrease in money demand, other things equal. All right, so B tells us that we're going to imagine that the price level rises, but income and the interest rate are unchanged. What happens to money demand? Well, if income is unchanged, people are not going to make any change in their purchasing. They're going to buy the same amount of goods and services. Since the price level is higher, they're going to require more money to make these transactions. So we can see the connection pretty easily here. An increase in the price level causes an increase in money demand, all other things equal. How is the interest rate determined? Well, we start with supply and demand. We're going to create a model here. The money supply curve is a vertical curve. It is fixed, and we make the assumption that it is fixed by the Federal Reserve. So changes in the interest rate have no effect on the money supply. They're not in any way related. The money demand curve is downward sloping. There's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the amount of money demanded. So we can see that if the interest rate decreases, the money demand will increase. That's that inverse relationship between the two variables. The equilibrium point is where, just like in any other market, supply and demand come together, and that gives us an equilibrium price for the use of money. Now the interest rate effect works in this way. If we have a change in the price level, let's say it's a decrease in the price level, it's going to reduce money demand, and this is going to reduce the interest rate. So we can see that pretty clearly here, that the price level is going to reduce the interest rate. The question is, how does it affect the aggregate demand curve? Well, if you remember, the aggregate demand curve is C plus I plus G plus XN. That's that 4 components of the aggregate demand curve. So that decrease in R is going to increase investment, right? So the increase in investment and the quantity of goods and services is also going to, or service demanded is going to increase. So the price change, remember a change in price only leads to a new point along the demand curve. It does not shift the demand curve. It simply takes us to a new point on the demand curve. Monetary policy, the effects that it has on aggregate demand. To achieve macroeconomic goals, the Fed uses monetary policy to shift the AD curve. That's the purpose of monetary policy, is to have the money supply changes ultimately affect the aggregate demand curve. And it's really important to understand the process for this, because on its surface we say, well, the Fed sets monetary policy and they set the money supply for the most part, and what effect does that have on aggregate demand? So the policy instrument the Fed has is the money supply. They can make policies that will adjust the money supply. And the news often tells us, if we're watching TV and they say, well, the Fed is setting or targeting interest rates. And what they really mean is that they're setting a target for the federal funds rate. And I talked about that in a previous chapter. The federal funds rate is that market for excess reserves, where banks are making loans to one another for short-term loans, usually overnight loans, and the rate that is set between the suppliers and demanders of money in that market is a private market rate. So it is determined not by some outside force, but by the participants in the market. The suppliers are those with excess reserves to loan, and the demanders are those who are looking for those short-term loans. So the Fed makes policies that target this rate through their actions, but they don't actually set the rate. To change the interest rate and then to subsequently shift the aggregate demand curve, the Fed conducts open market operations to change the money supply. So what they do is they make policies that affect the actions of the participants in this market without actually changing the market conditions itself. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Reducing the money supply, remember the Fed's only policy tool is to change the money supply. So let's say that the Fed enacts a policy to reduce the money supply. Their goal, of course, is to raise that interest rate. So here's what they do. They simply shift that demand or supply curve, rather, money supply curve to the left, and that can be whatever Fed tool they use. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but generally they use open market operations as their primary tool. And in this case, since they want to reduce the money supply, they're going to sell bonds, right? Sell equals small. And they're going to shift that money supply curve to the left. Now, when it meets with the demand for money, which hasn't changed at all given this scenario, we can see that the interest rate increases. At the same time, the effect on the aggregate demand curve is going to have an effect on the quantity of goods and services demanded. A higher interest rate is going to affect prices, right? And it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve down, because the higher interest rate means that for consumers, they're going to pay more for the money that they use, and that's going to have a diminishing effect on aggregate demand. It's going to shift aggregate demand to the left. Another effect, and we can make a different connection here, but it has the same result, and that is if we look at the investment curve, right? The demand for money for investment. So let's say here's our demand for investment funds, and that's the relationship again between the interest rate, and I'll just use a little I here for interest rate, and the quantity of funds. So if the interest rate rises, let's say the initial interest rate is here, and the interest rate rises, it's going to lower the demand for funds for investment, decrease investment, which again is part of what makes up the aggregate demand curve, and that decrease in investment will decrease all of aggregate demand, because I'm trying to find a place to write this. Aggregate demand is a combination of C plus I plus G plus XN. So if one portion of it decreases, and by the way, I use Y and AD interchangeably, but if that I decreases, then the entire value of that decreases. So the line shifts to the left. A little practice here. For each of these events, see if you can see the short-run effects on output and how the Fed should adjust the money supply to stabilize output. So we're given 3 events here. So in the first case, Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending. This is a fiscal policy action, and this would reduce aggregate demand and output. Right? Cutting government spending. If fiscal policy is spending and taxation, there's really only 2 possible outcomes for either one: increase or decrease, increase or decrease. And remember, we're still talking about aggregate demand. So fiscal policy is going to be part of this government expenditures portion. So if spending increases, this is just a definitional thing, it's going to boost aggregate demand because it's a component of the total. If spending decreases, it's going to reduce aggregate demand. Taxation works a little differently because that affects different parts of this. Taxation, an increase in taxation takes money out of the hands of consumers and investors. And so an increase in taxation will decrease aggregate demand. A decrease in taxation will put more money into the hands of others, and that will be an increase in aggregate demand. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, wait a minute, but taxation has to do with government revenues. And one thing to keep in mind is when we're looking at aggregate demand and we look at the G portion of it, we're only looking at government expenditures, not necessarily the revenues that are connected to taxation. So that might at first bother you a little bit, but I think you can make sense of it. So in the case of trying to balance the budget by cutting government spending, we're going to see that cutting government spending is going to reduce aggregate demand and output, right? Because output, this is Y or AD, same thing. To stabilize the output, what should the Federal Reserve do? Because if this is going to reduce aggregate demand, how can the Federal Reserve enact monetary policy to counteract that? So what they should do is increase the money supply, and this action should reduce the interest rate to increase aggregate demand. So we can go through that whole scenario we saw before. So here's our money supply, here's our money demand. If they increase the money supply, so we go from 1 to 2, it's going to reduce the interest rate. Here's the rate 1, here's the rate 2, and that's going to have the effect on aggregate demand, right? Reducing the interest rate is going to increase aggregate demand. For B, a stock market boom increases household wealth. And this event is going to increase aggregate demand. That's a pretty simple one. That's the wealth effect, and that's going to affect consumption, which again is a major component of aggregate demand and output. And so it's going to increase aggregate demand, and it's going to raise output above its natural rate. So we could see that graphically. What it's going to do is we're going to have, here's equilibrium, And remember, this is a short run aggregate supply and demand. Here's our long run aggregate supply. So in the short run, if they increase aggregate demand with this wealth effect from the stock market boom, that's going to do a few things. The biggest thing it's going to do is it's going to create a condition here, and the name for this is an inflationary gap. And it's called that because it pushes prices up and we are producing beyond our capacity. And it puts inflationary pressure on the economy because here we are, where output is above its natural rate. We talked about that in the last chapter. Price level is rising because remember, this particular model measures the price level against output, total output. And so the stock market boom is great and it makes people feel better off, but for the economy in general, it creates a position where we are facing inflationary pressure on the economy. We're producing beyond our capacity really, and we're seeing upward rising price level. To stabilize this, and so with this inflationary gap, you've got this inflationary pressure, the Fed's response to that is going to be to reduce the money supply. They want to take that inflationary pressure away. So the Fed is going to, and then of course this is the market for money, so a little different here. And this is the interest rate, right? Because we're talking about the price of money, or the use of money, and the quantity of money. And so in this case, the Fed is going to reduce the money supply with the goal of increasing that interest rate. And that higher interest rate will discourage investment and consumption. And as a result, it's going to reduce aggregate demand. And that's the goal. The entire purpose of the Fed's policy of adjusting the interest rate, adjusting the money supply, is to affect the interest rate and therefore eventually adjust aggregate demand. And so basically they work as either the gas or the brake in the economy. If the economy is in a condition like this, where they're in a boom cycle, this is great, but a boom also leads to inflation. And the Fed's job is to manage conditions of inflation and recession. So here, if they see an inflationary gap arising, their job is to put on the brakes. And we saw that just recently. In the last few weeks, the Fed has been raising their target for interest rates. That means they've been taking monetary policy actions to reduce the money supply, which will put upward pressure on interest rates, which will slow down the economy, which will shift aggregate demand. And the purpose is because we've seen such a boom in the stock market and we've seen so many signs that the economy is taking off that they want to manage any potential for inflation. So it's a good time to be studying this because you can see why the Fed is taking the actions they are. The third scenario you're given is war breaking out in the Middle East. This causes oil prices to go up tremendously. Now, this is an interesting thing because this was written a few years back and we're not quite as tied to oil from the Mideast as we used to be. But let's go ahead and go with this scenario. Let's say that oil prices, because of supply chain issues, are suddenly very, very high. What's this going to do? Well, those high oil prices are going to reduce aggregate supply because they're an input into production. So it's going to reduce that short run aggregate supply curve. Output is going to fall, right? So if we just look at the short run scenario, here's demand, aggregate demand. And output is going to fall. And of course, prices are going to go up, as you can imagine. So we have that condition known as stagflation. And the question then continues with what stabilization policies should the Fed enact to solve this problem? Well, what they're going to try to do is get some money into the economy. So they're going to increase the money supply. So let's go back through that again. here's the money supply, money demand picture here. And this measures the the relationship between the interest rate and the quantity of money. And so here's our initial interest rate. They're going to increase that money supply, and of course they'll do that by generally open market operations, which are going to be buying bonds, right? Buy equals bigger. They want more money for the money supply. So they're going to shift that curve to the right. That's going to bring that interest rate down. And the whole goal of getting that interest rate down is to shift that aggregate demand curve, right? Because with lower interest rates, consumption, investment will be incentivized and encouraged. It's going to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right. And that was the goal of their policy. And if we look here, we can put it back into the original. And let's say they shift that aggregate demand curve. Now here's an interesting problem. You still are going to have high prices, right? In fact, you're going to have even higher prices. They're going to ratchet up a bit. However, it does get that output back to stabilization levels. So where you would, this was your original output, then you had that reduction, at least that increase in aggregate demand, even though prices are ratcheting upwards, it still gets the economy back on track in terms of production. So periods of stagflation lead to really long-term price increases. Prices rarely come down from those levels of stagflation. All right, the concept of a liquidity trap is when monetary policy tries to stimulate aggregate demand by reducing the interest rate, but the interest rate is so low there's really nowhere to go. So that's what a liquidity trap is, when the monetary policy really can't do any more good than it is. If you've got an interest rate that is 0 or close to 0, the only tool the Fed has is to cut the interest rate. And so when there's no room to cut, that's what we call a liquidity trap. And the problem with this is, I think, pretty obvious, that monetary policy doesn't work because there's really nothing else that can be done. Now, one thing that central banks have done, not in this country, I know it happened in Japan not too long ago, but it is an option, is they could make real interest rates negative by raising inflation expectations. And that is one thing that they can try. They try to avoid that because you know, you can set these goals or these expectations, but relying on them is kind of tricky. The other thing the central bank can do, and this is something they have done not too long ago, is they can conduct open market operations using other assets. Besides just treasury securities, they can use other assets like mortgages and corporate debt, and they can affect changes in rates on those sorts of instruments. And they did this in 2008, 2009, and that's one of the ways that they managed the housing crisis. The Fed actually bought up a bunch of the bad mortgage loan pools and traded in those. Fiscal policy, by definition, is the setting of government spending and taxation levels. And this is done by government policymakers. Generally, it's considered the actions of the President and Congress. Expansionary fiscal policy are those actions that seek to expand the aggregate demand. So remembering the aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus XN. It seeks to increase government spending, or it can also seek a decrease in taxation. The taxation effects are generally for consumers and investors. The G is the government expenditures, and either one of those two actions are going to increase aggregate demand. Contractionary fiscal policy are those things that seek to shrink the economy, really, which sounds kind of counterproductive, but it has a time and a place. And so these are going to be actions that either reduce consumption and investment or reduce government spending. So a decrease in government spending would be a direct reduction in government spending, and in order to reduce consumption and investment, an increase in taxation, the rate of taxation. Those two things will shift aggregate demand to the left. Fiscal policy has two effects on aggregate demand, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it's not so much that they have to make cuts or change taxes. They have to know how those things are going to affect actual people. And we have to understand this thing called the multiplier effect. We've seen it before in the banking system, and we understand how important it is for the Fed to target their actions knowing that there's going to be a multiplier effect. Well, there's also a multiplier effect for fiscal policy. And the idea is that money spent in one area is going to expand and continue moving. So here's an example. The government buys $20 billion worth of planes from Boeing, right? That would be one of those government expenditures. Boeing's revenue increases by $20 billion. Well, that's not going to just sit there. That $20 billion is going to move through the economy. Boeing is going to distribute it to their workers as wages. They're going to distribute it to their shareholders. And those people are then going to use the money that they receive as consumers, and they're going to spend some portion of this additional income. Now, we don't assume they'll spend all of it, but we want to understand as much as possible what portion of this we can expect for them to spend, because that goes and continues to move throughout the economy. This extra consumption of theirs is going to further increase aggregate demand, right? Because imagine all the transactions that will happen as each individual consumes more and more. Well, the multiplier effect then, by definition, is the additional shifts in aggregate demand that come from this initial change in fiscal policy. Okay? The multiplier effect, if we look at this graphically, we can see this $20 billion, an increase in government expenditures, initially shifts it to the right by $20 billion. Right? Because we say, well, Boeing got all that income. But the increase in income for Boeing causes consumption to rise, which shifts aggregate demand even further to the right. And we kind of looked at some of those intermediate transactions, but there's just a whole lot going on there. So what we want to understand then, if we understand that people are going to keep some of what they earn and spend other parts, understanding this thing called a marginal propensity to consume is going to help us to better understand how much of a multiplier effect we can expect. So how big is the multiplier effect? Well, it depends on how much consumers respond to increases in income. What do they do with that income? So we make an assumption, and another simplifying assumption here, and that is that consumers are either going to receive that extra income and spend it, or receive that extra income and save it. We expect that those are the only two options that they have. So that for every dollar of additional income, the typical consumer is going to either spend it or save it, or some combination of those two things. The marginal propensity to consume then is the fraction of extra income that they consume rather than save. So here's our example. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and income rises $100, then consumption is going to rise $80. Because what we're saying is we're going to save 20%, or 20 cents on the dollar, for each dollar of income, and we're going to spend 80 cents out of each dollar. And so consumption would rise by $80 for each $100 of additional income. And understanding this is going to be important, because if we're talking about how money moves through the economy and multiplies, well, it matters how much of each additional dollar do I spend and how much do I save. If I'm saving more, then clearly my consumption is going to rise by a much smaller factor. So this is an important piece of information. We have a nice nifty, neat formula for the multiplier, and the little delta that you see here stands for change. It's just a nice simple notation. And so we see change in government expenditures, and then change in Y and change in C are the ultimate changes, meaning that after we've applied the multiplier effect, the ultimate changes in Y and C. So we'll start with our identity that we've looked at a few times, the formula for aggregate demand. And we're going to say that a change in income is going to be equal to a change in consumption or government expenditure, right? We're going to eliminate these two factors from our discussion here because, again, goes back to our assumption that every dollar of additional income is either spent or saved, right? And now we're looking at the government's, how changes in government expenditures affect consumption and saving. So another identity here then is going to be that a change in income is going to be equal to that factor, that marginal propensity to consume, times the change in Y plus the change in G. And this is because the change in consumption is equal to, so we're just doing a little substitution here. Change in consumption, when we say that, really means how much of the income is going to be used for consumption, what percentage. So the marginal propensity to consume, if it's 0.8, for example, then my change in consumption is going to be equal to whatever that marginal propensity to consume is times that change in Y. I should use the delta. So when you see this, don't be worried. All we're doing is substituting this expression here for that change in consumption. All right, so the change in Y, if we solve for Y, that change in Y, we can say that 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume is times G is equal to this. So we've solved for that change in Y, and here's our formula. Here's our multiplier. Our multiplier is right here, because remember, we've eliminated this. So what we've done essentially is solve for the multiplier. So here's an easier way of seeing the multiplier. And trust me, you're not going to be asked to do this math. I just want you to see where it came from. But the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. The reason for that is because we'll go back to that assumption that every dollar of additional income is either saved or spent. So here's what we know. The marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to consume together equal 1. So think about it this way. If for every dollar my marginal propensity to consume is, let's say I know that for each additional dollar I earn, I'm going to spend 50 cents of it. I know that that's my marginal propensity to consume. Then what I can do is say, well, then my marginal propensity to save is obviously 50 cents, and it equals 1. So if I just rearrange this formula, it's MPS plus MPC equals 1, I can use this to come up with my multiplier. So all this is a restatement of this general rule that the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save accounts for every dollar that I have. So let's simplify this formula, because once you have the formula, it's pretty easy to use. I think understanding where it came from is a little challenging. So the size of the multiplier depends on the marginal propensity to consume, right? So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5, the multiplier is, if we plug it into this formula, 1 over 1 minus the MPC, and we said that the marginal propensity is 0.5, so 1 minus 0.5 is 0.5, so our multiplier is 1 divided by 0.5, 1 divided by 1/2 is 2. So it's actually easier to use than you might imagine. Another way of stating this, and I'm a fan of this, is to simply, instead of saying 1 over 1 minus MPC, you could say 1 over MPS. And if you're comfortable with that, great. If that makes you feel confused and unhappy, then by all means stick with this. They mean the same thing, and if this is manageable, I would stay with that. So if the MPC is 0.75, 1 minus 0.75 is 0.25. The multiplier 1 divided by 0.25 is 4. But you can see that if you like this idea, if the MPC is 0.5, then the MPS is 0.5. If the MPC is 0.75, then the MPS is 0.25. And so if I use this formula, you can see how I just saved a step. So again, it's personal choice. If the MPC is 0.9, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.9, which is 0.10, and multiplier is 10. And you can see this, that a larger MPC means a larger multiplier, right? And think about that logically. If more people are using more of their income, 90 cents out of every dollar rather than 50 cents, it should make sense that that money is going to multiply more through the economy. It's going to cause bigger changes in consumption, which of course turn into bigger changes in income. So, other applications. The multiplier effect tells us that every $1 increase in government expenditures, can generate more than a $1 increase in aggregate demand. So that's just a given, that for each $1 spent by the government, that money is going to multiply throughout the economy. It's also true for other components of GDP. So here's an example. Suppose a recession overseas reduces demand for U.S. net exports by $10 billion. Initially, aggregate demand falls by $10 billion. But it's not going to be just a $10 billion loss, because all the people that would have received that money as income are going to have less income and less consumption as a result. So this fall in income is going to cause consumption to fall, which is going to further reduce aggregate demand and income. So you can see it works in both directions. Any change in the components of GDP is going to have a ripple effect that is larger than the initial change, and in either direction, increase or decrease. So the multiplier effect is universal. Second thing to know is the crowding out effect. Fiscal policy, the effect on aggregate demand, can also cause a problem, an unexpected problem. So let's look at this. If we have fiscal expansion, right, and there's expansionary policy, either an increase in spending or a decrease in taxation, and this raises the interest rate because the goal of expansionary policy is to increase aggregate demand, right? So the interest rate rises, this reduces investment, and it reduces the net increase in aggregate demand. So it's interesting because what you have here is a policy that's intended, expansionary policy, it's intended to increase aggregate demand. However, one of the unintended side effects is this increase in aggregate demand raises the interest rate. And as a result, that higher interest rate discourages investment. So what it really is a mitigating effect on the change. So it increases aggregate demand. However, there's the unexpected movement backwards, a little bit of backsliding, that's caused by that higher interest rate, which reduces investment. So if we're looking at this and looking at the components of GDP, we could say, well, government expenditures go up to cause that expansionary policy, but maybe there's an unexpected smaller decrease, so kind of a mitigating decrease in investment that's caused by that higher interest rate. So even though you do have a net effect of an increase in aggregate demand, still this crowding out effect kind of minimizes or cuts back on the positive effect. So the size of the aggregate demand shift ultimately is smaller than the initial fiscal expansion. And that's because of that, like I said, mitigating or minimizing effect, whichever word you like. And it's called the crowding out effect. And basically what it does is it crowds out. The government's borrowing money, they're raising the interest rate, and this raised rate crowds out private investors because now it's too expensive for them to borrow. So here's a look graphically at the crowding out effect. So let's say we have a $20 billion increase in government expenditures, that expansionary fiscal policy. And initially, it shifts the aggregate demand curve right by $20 billion. right? And we would expect that. But, the higher income increases money demand, and that will increase the interest rate, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand. So not by as much as the initial increase, but you can see that it has an impact on the amount of the increase in aggregate demand. All right, changes in taxes. A tax cut has an effect on households' take-home pay, how much money they've got in their pocket, and households, of course, are going to respond to this. They're going to spend a portion of this extra income, shifting aggregate demand to the right. And the size of that shift, like the size of shifts in other cases, is affected by the multiplier and the crowding out effects. How much effect will those have on the total expenditures after everybody has made all those transactions? Another factor to consume is whether households perceive the tax cut to be temporary or permanent. And as you can imagine, if they conceive it to be temporary, they're going to be a little more cautious about spending that money. And there's probably going to be a lower marginal propensity to consume and a higher marginal propensity to save. A permanent tax cut is probably going to be one that people feel more confident about and more willing to spend. So that's going to lead to a bigger increase in consumption because consumer confidence matters, and it's going to cause a larger shift in aggregate demand. Little practice here. Let's assume the economy is in recession and that shifting the aggregate demand curve rightward by $200 billion would end the recession. And so that's the goal of the policy itself, the fiscal policy. Let's assume that we know that the MPC is equal to 0.8. What that means is that for every additional dollar in income, people are going to spend 80 cents of it and save 20 cents of it. So right there, we know our MPC, we know that there's no crowding out, and the question is, how much should Congress increase government spending to end the recession? So their goal is to achieve $200 billion in increase in aggregate demand to end the recession. They know what the MPC is, and they can assume no crowding out effect. And then for B, let's assume that there is a crowding out effect. Will Congress need to increase government spending more or less than this amount? So let's look at this. For A, we can figure out the multiplier pretty easily. If MPC is 0.8, 1 over 1 minus MPC is our multiplier. So we can say 1 over 0.2. So our multiplier is 5. Right? So we know that for every dollar in government expenditures, $5 in aggregate demand will be created, right? Because there's no crowding out effect to minimize that. So we've got our multiplier, and they want to ultimately move that curve by $200 billion. So we can just do simple division here and say they should increase government spending by $40 billion. Again, it's important to see why we need this information. Why would the government want this? Because if they just dumped $200 billion in the economy, they would way overshoot the mark and do damage by causing a great deal of inflation. Also, they don't just dump that money, it has to come from somewhere. So they would, do other harm in the economy by doing that. So for A, pretty simple answer. Now B asks us to factor in the crowding out effect. So what we really need to know is not the exact numbers for the crowding out effect, but what it will do to the overall change. So crowding out reduces the impact of that money spent on aggregate demand. So rather than being $40 billion, they'd have to actually increase government spending by a larger amount to account for that crowding out effect. Crowding out is going to minimize its impact, and so they won't get $200 worth of movement for $40 billion. They'll get something less than that. So they're going to need to increase that amount if they want to reach that $200 billion goal. Fiscal policy, an aggregate supply. Most economists believe the short-run effects mainly work through aggregate demand. So there's not a whole lot of connection between the decisions of the government and aggregate supply, but there are some recognized effects by some economists. Recall back from chapter 1 that people respond to incentives, and it's powerful to understand that tax rates give workers an incentive to work more. So if the government wants to affect aggregate supply, one tool they might use is this ability to decrease tax rates in order to incentivize workers to work more, which could have a positive impact on aggregate supply. And also, and people who believe this, in effect, are called supply-siders. You probably have heard that term related to Ronald Reagan and the supply-side economics of the 80s, where fiscal policies were generally aimed at incentivizing producers. And so supply-side economics focuses the effects of policy actions on the supply side of the economy. Another way the government might affect aggregate supply is through aggregate purchases, or government purchases. Let's say the government increases spending on the roads. Better roads might increase business productivity, and again, that's going to have a positive effect on aggregate supply and shift it to the right. And this is probably more of a long-run effect. It takes a lot of time and planning to build roads and put them into use, but again, that is just one of the theories that says that government can affect the supply side through their policies. Since the Employment Act of 1946, economic stabilization has really been the goal of U.S. policy. Economists don't always agree on how active the government should be when they're taking on this role, but there are some propositions that it should be a very active thing, an ongoing thing, the Keynesian belief in the animal spirits. And animal spirits is an interesting term. You probably heard it in the videos from the last lesson where Keynes and Hayek are disagreeing, and Keynes says the animal spirits cause waves of feelings, pessimism, optimism among households and firms, and that these animal spirits really drive people in their consumption and savings decisions, fear and hopefulness, really. And so for those reasons, the government should be actively involved in making stabilization policy, and that was Keynes's view. In fact, Keynes really encouraged not just government intervention, but government deficits as an active way of maintaining stable government policies. Other factors can cause fluctuations besides just these, Keynes termed these animal spirits. Booms and recessions in other countries, the stock market behavior in this country, all of these cause changes. And again, this is another argument for the active use of government policy to stabilize economic changes. If policymakers do nothing, these economists argue, these fluctuations can be destabilizing to businesses, workers, and consumers. And so this is the case for active stabilization policy. Proponents of this believe the government should use the policy tools they have available to reduce these fluctuations. When the GDP falls below its natural rate, they say that the government should use expansionary, monetary, or fiscal policy to reduce or prevent a recession. Now, the government, of course, does not use monetary policy. Those are the actions of the Federal Reserve, and the government does not direct the activities of the Federal Reserve. But they're saying that generally policies that are made should focus on this idea of expansionary policy, economic policy. When GDP rises above its natural rate, again, the case for active policy says that contractionary policies should be employed to produce or reduce or prevent a boom. So some examples of Keynesians and this Keynesian thinking in the White House would be 1961, John Kennedy pushed for a tax cut, which would be a Keynesian policy, right? That's government intervention. And he pushed for a tax cut to stimulate aggregate demand, and quite a few of his economic advisors were direct followers of Keynes. In fact, they were contemporaries of Keynes. In 2009, we saw with the housing crisis and the meltdown we had that President Obama pushed for spending increases and tax cuts. In fact, if you remember, there was about a $900 billion stimulus package that was passed in 2009. And you probably heard all the shovel-ready jobs and all that stuff. And that was a package intended to get the economy back on its feet and to increase aggregate demand in the face of what was going on then. Now there's another case, and this is against active stabilization policy. This would be the view that you saw in those videos of Hayek. Hayek was more of a laissez-faire, hands-off, let's keep the government out of it. So the case against active stabilization says a few things. First of all, that monetary policy affects economies with a long lag time. You know, these things don't happen quickly, and we don't really know the long-term effects for a long time. And so when we're quick to invoke policy, we sometimes are doing harm in the long run that we can't see right away. So let's say that firms make investment plans in advance, and investors take time to respond to the changes in the interest rate. And, you know, it can take about 6 months for a monetary policy to have any real effect on output and employment. Fiscal policy also has a lot of lags attached to it, not the least of which is the political part of it. Fiscal policy is extremely political. By definition, it's political. And so to get Congress to act quickly is just never going to happen. And so they require literally acts of Congress that are slow and political and, you know, fraught with all kinds of arguments and discussion. And so, again, these policies, you know, you want to say, well, the government should intervene. Well, it's easier said than done. And, of course, the legislative process can take months or years, and we're watching that as we speak, right? So due to these lags, the critics of active policy say that these policies, in the long run, since we don't really know how it's going to turn out, can do more harm than good. By the time that they affect aggregate demand, the economy could be in a totally different situation, and we could have a policy that suddenly starts to have effect and does a lot of harm. Automatic stabilizers are interesting. They're changes in fiscal policy that stimulate aggregate demand automatically, just like they sound, when the economy goes into recession and without policymakers having to take any action. And the good news, the good thing about automatic stabilizers is that they don't have to go through that political process. They are built into the law. So there are things like the tax system. We have a progressive tax system that automatically, in times of recession, causes taxes to be lower, and when there's better conditions, taxes go up. So they serve to balance things without having to change the law. So the tax system, being a progressive tax system, achieves that. Government spending. There are certain things in the government budgets that affect the ongoing programs, I should say, that affect government spending. So in times of recession, more people are going to be looking for public assistance, and that's going to increase the government spending on those things. Now, this is not part of that G. This is not government expenditures. These are transfer payments. But when we have times of recession, more money is going to go to the people that require it, whereas in better times, there's going to be less of it. So again, these are automatic programs built in to the law that automatically offset fluctuations in the economy. So in conclusion, policymakers need to consider all the effects of their actions. So when Congress cuts taxes, and of course they do, they should consider the short-run effects on aggregate demand and the long-run effects on saving and growth. When the Fed, and this is the actions of the Federal Reserve, but when the Fed reduces the rate of money growth, it must take into account not only the long-run effects on inflation, but the short-run effects on output and employment. And of course, these things are carefully considered when these changes are made. So to summarize the chapter, we looked at the theory of liquidity preference, how the interest rate adjusts to balance the demand for money with the supply of money. The interest rate effect helps explain why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. An increase in the price level raises money demand, which raises the interest rate, which reduces investment, which reduces the aggregate quantity of goods and services demanded. My advice to you is to practice that chain of events and see it graphically so that you can consistently understand how one part of those changes affects another. An increase in the money supply causes the interest rate to fall, which stimulates investment, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Another one that you might want to see graphically. Expansionary fiscal policy, which is a spending increase or a tax cut, is going to shift aggregate demand to the right, and contractionary fiscal policy shifts aggregate demand to the left. When the government alters spending or taxes, the resulting shift in aggregate demand can be larger or smaller than the fiscal change, given two effects: the multiplier effect, which is going to amplify the effects of a fiscal policy on aggregate demand, and the crowding out effect tends to dampen the effects of fiscal policy on aggregate demand. Economists don't always agree on how active policymakers should be when trying to stabilize the economy and make economic policy. Some argue that the government should use those policies to combat destabilizing fluctuations and be active in that use, and others argue that those policy changes are going to have a destabilizing effect because there's not a clear understanding of the long-term effects. All right, so this is our last chapter. I will do a review for our last exam that's going to cover the last 4 chapters, and I wish you lots of luck.